today we're going to read the Hutchman Book of School Stories, Part 6, Leaving Mrs. Ellis. Mrs. Ellis was the nicest teacher at Leo's school. She was a kind, gentle lady with a very soft lap. Leo had been in Mrs. Ellis's class for a year, but it felt as if he had known her forever. She was so familiar to Leo. She seemed like part of the family, not his mom. There was nobody like his mom, but very close. A big sister, maybe, or an auntie. Leo often thought he would like to marry Mrs. Ellis when he grew up, although deep down he knew he couldn't because she was already married to Mr. Ellis. But he was very fond of her. Every summer, before the children went off for the holidays, there was a summer fair. This year, Leo's mom was in charge of the cake stall, and she had been busy baking cakes and freezing them for weeks. One day, when Leo got home, Mom had all the cakes laid out on the kitchen table. She was icing them and decorating them, some with tiny colored sweets, some with hundreds and thousands, and some with cherries and little silver balls. Leo's mouth watered. "Yummy," he said. "I thought you could take this one to school tomorrow." Mom said, "I thought you could give it to Mrs. Ellis." Leo was puzzled. "Why?" he said. "I thought all the cakes were for the summer fair." "It's a way of saying thank you," Mom explained. Leo was even more puzzled and a bit worried. "Thank you for what?" he asked. "Well," said Mom, "thank you for having you in her class this year. Thank you for teaching you so much. Thank you for looking after you. Now, how about testing some of this shortbread?" But Leo didn't want any shortbread. Suddenly, the cakes didn't look and smell so nice. He didn't want his tea either. He just picked at it, and later, when he went to bed, he couldn't get to sleep. The next morning, Leo didn't want to get up. "I want to stay in bed," he told Mom. "I'm poorly. I got a tummy ache." Mom felt his forehead and looked at him. "Is it a real tummy ache?" She asked him gently. "Or an I don't want to go to school tummy ache?" Leo went red and turned away and looked at the wall. "It's real," he whispered. "I feel sick." "Leo," said Mom, "tell me what's wrong." Leo turned back and looked at her. "It's Mrs. Ellis," he said at last. "I shan't be in her class anymore. Next year, someone else will be my teacher." "But you already knew that," Mom said, "didn't you?" "I knew it in my head," said Leo. "I think I did. But only yesterday, it was only yesterday when you made the cake that I knew in my tummy I don't want to leave Mrs. Ellis." "Mom, I want to stay in her class." Mom stroked his hair and told him that he was growing up, and when you grow up, things have to change. Otherwise, you would stay a baby forever, and that wouldn't be right. Leo started to feel a little better, and he got up and got dressed, and he went to school. But when he was running around the playground with his friend Andrew at playtime, he suddenly thought of something that made him feel ill again. He suddenly remembered who was going to be his teacher next year. It was Miss Lioness. Everyone was scared of Miss Lyons. All of the children at Leo's school were terrified at her. Even some of the teachers seemed frightened by her tallness and her stern face and her loud, booming voice. Leo sometimes thought that even the parents must be scared of her. Mrs. Leon's class was always the quietest in school. Leo thought they must be too scared to make any noise at all. And now he was to be in her class. Leo couldn't bear it. That night, he had a terrible nightmare. He dreamed he was being chased by an enormous lion with wings like a dragon and a tail like a snake. It was coming for him, nearer and nearer and nearer. He woke up with a jump, hot and sweaty, and with a thumping heart. Mom was bending over him, tying up her dressing gown. "Are you all right?" she said. "You were calling Mrs. Ellis. Was that it is a bad dream?" Leo nodded and sat up, wiping tears from the cheeks. "It wasn't Mrs. Ellis, though," he told Mom. "It was Mrs. Lyons." But he wouldn't tell her any more. It seemed so silly. Now he was awake. Miss Lyons was just a lady, not a wild animal at all. She couldn't eat him, not really, could she? At last it was the summer fair. Leo had mostly been looking forward to it. It was fun, with lots of stalls to spend pocket money and throwing the wet sponge at teachers and parents, cooking beef burgers and at a fancy dress parade. But part of him was sad too, because after the summer fair came the holidays, and after the holidays there would be no more Mrs. Ellis. Mrs. Ellis went to the cake stall to thank Leo's mom for the chocolate cake. Leo was there too, helping out and eating all the broken bits. "It was delicious," said Mrs. Ellis. "A wonderful cake. It was very kind of you." "Well," said Mom, "it was from Leo, really, to say thank you." Mrs. Ellis smiled. "He's a good boy," she said. "I get very fond of all my children. I miss them all once they've moved up. And I shall miss Leo especially. He paints such good pictures. He painted a lovely picture of a lion last week. It was so good I put it on display on the classroom wall. He has a very vivid imagination." Leo had heard about vivid imaginations before from Mom. They were what gave you good ideas for paintings and stories, she said. They were what gave you terrible nightmares about lions with dragon wings and snakes' tails. On the whole, Leo wished his imagination wasn't quite so vivid. Soon it was all over, the whole Mrs. Ellis year gone forever. Leo was very sad to think she would never be his teacher again. "I know it's sad," Mom told him, "but you'll soon get used to it once you're back in school, just as you'll soon get used to your new teacher." "No, I won't," said Leo gloomily. "It's Mrs. Lyons." He tried to explain to Mom how horrible and frightening and booming Mrs. Lyons was, but Mom couldn't seem to understand. All she would say was, "Try not to worry. I'm sure you'll soon get to like her." That night, Leo and the lion had the lion-dragon dream again. It was even worse than usual. Afterwards, when Mom had soothed away the fear and gone back to bed, Leo lay awake in the dark. He wondered if he would ever get over leaving Mrs. Ellis. One morning, Mom took Leo shopping with her. She had to go to the supermarket, which Leo usually hated, but Mom had promised to take him out to lunch afterwards for a treat. "Can it be pizza?" Leo asked her. "It can be anything you like." Mom told him. So he followed her around the enormous shop and looked without interest as the packets of biscuits and tins of soup while she filled the trolley. He soon realized that Mom had stopped and was talking to somebody. It wasn't until he got up close that he saw, to his horror, that the somebody was Mrs. Lyons. He couldn't turn and run. She'd already seen him. "Why, hello, Leo," she boomed. "And how are you today?" Leo didn't answer. He wasn't being rude. He just couldn't speak. Mom carried on talking to her instead about Mrs. Lyon's cats, and while they talked, Leo sneaked a look in Mrs. Lyon's water basket. Sure enough, there were tins of cat food. There was also one frozen pork chop, 2 apples in a plastic bag, and a small jar of coffee. Leo looked at his mother's trolley and all the food for Mom and Dad and him. He felt a little pang of pity for Mrs. Lyons and her single pork chop and just her cats for company. Mrs. Lyons was talking to him. "You paint lovely pictures, don't you, Leo?" she was saying. "I saw a lion painting on Mrs. Ellis's classroom wall. Will you paint one for me, just for fun, just for me to enjoy? Would you do that for me?" Leo and Mom looked at each other. Then he looked at Mrs. Lyons. "Yes," he said in a loud, clear voice. "Yes, I will." He started painting as soon as he got home, but it still took a long time to get it right. It was going to be a picture of cats, as Mrs. Lyon liked cats, but it didn't turn out like that. It was a picture of his nightmare, the lion dragon one. But in the picture, Leo wasn't running away. In the picture, Leo was one of King Arthur's knights, and he was standing over the lion dragon with a sword held high in the air, because he had fought the monster and killed it stone dead. It was a very good painting. Leo thought it was one of the best he had ever done. "Can we take it to Mrs. Lyon's house?" he asked Mom when the painting was dry. Mom thought about it. "I think she'd like that," she said, "but we should telephone first." "Are you sure we wouldn't rather post it?" Mrs. Lyons had given Mom her address at the supermarket. "No," said Leo, "I want to take it to her." So Leo and Mom took the painting round to Mrs. Lyon's house, which wasn't a house at all, but a flat. It was a very nice flat. Leo and Mom sat down while Mrs. Lyons spread the painting out on her big table and looked at it very carefully. Leo could hear a slow, gentle tick of a clock. One of Mrs. Lyon's cat jumped up into Leon's lap and spread itself out, purring and pushing at him with its paws. At last, Mrs. Lyons finished looking at the painting. She took off her glasses. "It's very good," she said. It was funny, but she didn't seem to be quite so booming anymore. "In fact, it's excellent. And did you do it all by yourself?" Leo nodded. "It took ages," he said, and explained the story of the painting about the knight and the lion dragon. Mrs. Lyons listened carefully to Leo, and when he finished, she smiled at him. Leo had never seen Mrs. Lyons smile before. It changed her whole face. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most people would have to run away from that monster. It was very brave of you to face up to it." "I know," said Leo. "I know that now." "And now," said Mrs. Lyons, "how about some tea?" There were buttered scones and fruit cake and chocolate biscuits for tea. Leo had orange squash to drink, and Mom and Mrs. Lyons had tea that smelled like old bonfires. The striped cat sat on Leo's lap again, and Mrs. Lyons said her name was Moggy. "I'm afraid I don't have as much imagination as you," she told Leo. "Isn't it funny how we're all together this afternoon? There's Moggy the cat, and there you're Leo the lion, and I'm Mrs. Lyons. Isn't that strange?" And Leo had to agree that it was. On the first day back at school, Leo and his friend Andrew lined up together in the playground. When the bell rang, they went in together. After they had hung up their coats in the cloakroom, Andrew started to go the old way to Mrs. Ellis's classroom. "Where are you going?" Leo asked him. "To class," said Andrew. Then he realized. "Oh," he said, "I forgot. We're not in Mrs. Ellis's class anymore, are we?" "No," said Leo. "We're bigger now. We're older. We're in Mrs. Lyons' class this year." And off they went together. The end. I like this book because it's how you grow and learn and you change. What about you?
I like that he was scared that he was changing a new teacher.
Bye. I hope you like this book.